Book 4 of 4, Epilogue. Chapter 24, In Russia's Fields. 3 years had passed, and the fourth was underway. Late on an afternoon in August 1921, Hilda was coming down one of the gray, dilapidated streets of the city of Domsk on the Polish-Russian border. 2 years earlier, an army fighting under Allied command had taken the white Russian city, and it was now the farthest outpost of non-Bolshevist Europe to the east. Beyond it lay the Soviet Empire. Hilda had come to Domsk with the first American relief expedition that entered the stricken city. She walked slowly, partly because the day was warm, and partly in response to an inner mood. Her days in Domsk were numbered. The American Relief Mission was closing its activities. The acute suffering and hunger which followed in the wake of the war had been stilled. The chronic want of the desolate population, on the other hand, was beyond the scope of any relief agency. The 20-odd relief workers, including Hilda, were hourly expecting word from Washington, ordering them back to the United States. Hilda was gazing at the mud-colored one-story houses and at the people with their ashen faces and deep, patient eyes, as if trying to absorb and store away in her mind a lasting memory of them. She was known to most of the inhabitants of the city, some 28,000 souls in all. Nearly every one of them had passed through one of her clinics or children's kitchens in the year and a half the relief mission had been among them. Wide, bearded peasants lifted their hats and bowed to the waist as she passed their houses. Kerchiefed women sang out their good day and blessing fervently. Hilda answered their greetings, not without sadness. They had grown so near to her, these simple, primitive people. She had witnessed so many of their sorrows. It was like parting from old friends. From one peasant hut, 2 little children came out and ran up to her, beaming. She stopped to talk to them in the few words of Russian she had acquired. "How are you, Zosha?" she asked the little girl, whose straight flaxen hair was falling loosely about her shoulders. "I'm well, Barnya," which means lady, "quite well now," the girl replied. "And you, Vasilka," she addressed a barefooted youngster of 6. The child blushed and lowered his head without answering. Hilda petted his cheek and smoothed the girl's hair, and the two went away happy. She turned into a side street. An old manor house surrounded by spacious grounds came into view. An American flag was flying over it. It was the home of the relief mission at Domsk. She entered. The place was in commotion. People were running from room to room excitedly. "Are we going home?" she asked the first person she met. "No, to Russia," was the hurried answer. On the bulletin board was part of the text of a telegram just received from Washington, amplifying this information. America, the message said, was coming to the aid of the famine-stricken population of Russia. Negotiations were underway for the feeding of 1 million starving children. The personnel and equipment of the relief mission at Domsk was to be held in readiness to proceed to Moscow. Hilda read the message over again. Yes, they were going into Russia. She was going. Russia. Hillstrom. She went up to her room, but did not stay there long. She went down into the garden, A short distance from the house was an apple orchard, and under one of its trees, well to the rear, was a secluded bench upon which she had often sat alone, musing. She sought that bench now. In the 3.5 years which had elapsed since Hilda had left America for the war zone in Europe as Red Cross nurse, she and Hillstrom had not seen one another. They served in divergent parts of France until the armistice. With the signing of the armistice, she applied for relief service in Poland, was accepted, and transferred to Warsaw. Hillstrom had been ordered into Germany with the occupation troops. 6 months later, she heard from him from New York. His unit had been demobilized and he was sent home. His hope of getting into Russia was frustrated. She had received 6 letters at intervals of 2 or 3 months from him thereafter. His letters were not cheerful. Things at home were in a chaos, he wrote, were going from bad to worse. The ranks of the proletariat were hopelessly divided. The war had divided them. The socialist and radical elements were split a dozen different ways. Hate and suspicion had taken the place of unity and confidence. Comrades were leaping at each other's throats. While the forces of progress were engaging in feudal conflicts among themselves, the Tories and reactionaries were boldly lifting their heads. He was thinking of Russia more than ever now, Hillstrom wrote. He would like to go there, even if it were only to get away from the twilight period at home. He was writing guardedly for her sake, for his own. There was no telling when one of his letters might fall into unfriendly hands. The war was over, but its base institutions were still flourishing. The whole world was still enmeshed in a net of hostile prying into man's private opinions and affairs. There was still an almost worldwide censorship in operation. Hilda pored over each of Hillstrom's letters for weeks, searching every line, every word for possible meaning and significance. Then his letters abruptly ceased coming. She had not heard from him for more than a year. It had been in accord with Hillstrom's urging that she head toward Russia, and that he too would be aiming in the same direction, that Hilda had volunteered first as a Red Cross nurse and later for relief work in Eastern Europe. It was the work itself, however, that had kept her there long after these plans were frustrated. The work, her daily run of activities, from the first absorbed her. After each of Hillstrom's letters in particular, she would turn to her work as to a balm. Hillstrom was wasting his energies at home, and she could hope to do no better there, while here she was alleviating suffering day by day, hour by hour. There was so much suffering about her and so much resignation. People faced the fact of death simply and naturally. Many even looked forward to it as to a relief. Hilda felt as if the simple peasants to whom she was bringing the first rudimentary knowledge about their bodies were in turn confiding to her much greater secrets about her soul. They were teaching her how to live. They filled her heart with a strange peace. As once in the dim past, she had come to look upon her trials and suffering as part of the suffering of a class, her class, and derived great strength from it, so she now came to look upon her grief, her personal grief for her dead son, as a part of the grief of the world, and it consoled her. There were thousands of mothers sorrowing for the untimely death of their sons, of their children, all about her. As the relief mission proceeded deeper and deeper into the typhus belt, the corps of workers was dwindling. There were more hardships, greater insecurity, keener loneliness. None but volunteers were wanted, and one after another, the men and women with whom she had worked side by side for months, for years, took their leave and started for America. Hilda stayed on. The wider the prairies about her became, the denser the forests, the more primitive the villages and towns, the more restful she became, the greater the contentment that came over her. She felt like a hermit returning to the retreat from which he had strayed. It was wonderful to be so far removed from civilization. There were times, especially at night, as she gazed out upon the unbroken darkness that hung over the city, unbroken except for the stars, that she felt as if she were recovering from a long illness. Her past life, her suffering in Chicago, New York, Vulcan City, the horrors of war in France and of disease in Poland, all appeared to her as phantoms, as dreams of her delirium. They could not possibly have happened under these stars. There could not possibly be so much cruelty, so much ugliness in the world. Life must be beautiful. Men must be brothers. They were brothers. They were. The atmosphere at the mission suddenly changed. A tense secretiveness descended upon the place, upon the people immediately in charge of the office. Telegrams were coming one after another from Washington, from Paris, but their contents was not divulged. The major in charge, a strict military man, passed people without seeing them, or looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. Everyone was in suspense. After some days, things cleared. Not all of the relief workers were to enter Russia. Only a dozen were called for. The rest were to return home. The major, with two of his closest associates, were making the selection. Several men were quietly making preparations to go back to America. They knew that they would not be among those chosen. Hilda, too, was preparing herself in her mind, at least for the journey home. There were two other women workers besides herself. They were good mixers and had been on friendly terms with the heads, while she had kept to herself, always. They would no doubt choose one of them, and she would be sent home. Well, no matter. Upon returning from her rounds one afternoon, she found a call from the major on her table. She went down immediately. There were several people with him. The major nodded casually to her and handed her a slip to sign. All those going into Russia had to sign that slip. Hilda signed the paper and walked out. She was going into Russia. The rest of that afternoon and evening she was thinking of Hillstrom, recalling their last meeting, the last time they were together, wandering, dreaming. The American flag had been taken off the old manor house, and half a dozen trucks and automobiles stood in front of it. They were being carefully loaded with trunks, boxes, bundles. The sky overhead was laden, and the leaves were falling from the trees, yellow autumn leaves. A shrill wind was blowing. Several hundred of the townspeople stood some distance from the house. They had been waiting since early morning to witness the departure of the relief workers and were discussing things among themselves quietly. The Americans were going. Winter was coming. Winter. A little before noon, the loading of the trucks was finished, and the Americans emerged on the veranda dressed and ready for the journey. They were flanked by the chief officials of the city, who looked both stirred and solemn. The Americans took their places in the automobiles, and every hat in the crowd of spectators and well-wishers came off. The men were bowing low. The women crossed themselves. A few wept. There was a 2 hours run to the border. At 2 o'clock, the Americans reached it. Several Soviet officials were waiting for them. They looked young, seemed new to their job, and were not a little moved by the occasion. Passes were looked over politely. Nods and smiles were exchanged. A soldier pushed back a wooden gate. The automobiles passed, and the gate closed once more. Hilda was in Soviet Russia. For nearly a year, one of the largest locomotive repair plants, located some 200 miles south of Moscow, has had an American superintendent. During that period, the output of the factory has successively doubled and trebled. Recently, the Soviet government appointed a committee of technical experts to visit this plant and to make a study of the means and methods whereby the American superintendent achieves such singular success, with a view of applying these methods elsewhere. The committee of experts spent 10 days in the study and investigation of the plant and its manager. Its report to the Soviet government is one of the briefest official documents on record in Russia. The phenomenal situation at the X plant, the report says, is a purely individual matter. It is due entirely to the personality, character, and idealism of the man at the head of the works. The American superintendent is not an engineer. He is not even a mechanic. He has introduced no new machinery and no labor-saving devices. He merely works. He works 10 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours a day when necessary, and his example has an inspiring effect upon the people about him. Others want to work with him. He is devoted to the revolution and has but one slogan: work will save Russia. With that slogan, every laborer in the plant is familiar. He makes no other speeches. He shaves every morning. The heads of departments working immediately under him, too, have begun to shave. This American superintendent is Frank Hillstrom. "Any news from America?" Hillstrom asked his interpreter, who was glancing through a copy of the latest Russian newspaper to arrive from Moscow. They were sitting in the peasant hut which had been assigned to Hillstrom as his living quarters. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, and they had just finished their supper. In the small iron stove, a fire was going. It was the first week in October, but winter had already set in and the first snow was upon the ground. "Here's an item," the interpreter called out after a diligent search, and began to read slowly, giving the English version of the Russian text before him. "The personnel of the American Relief Mission at Tomsk," he read, "which had been ordered by the American government to proceed to Russia, reached Moscow yesterday. There's one woman in the party, Mrs. Hilda Thorson." "Read the last sentence again," Hillstrom said, quickly removing the pipe from between his teeth. The interpreter repeated the sentence. "Anything else there?" Hillstrom asked. His voice was casual once more. There was nothing else there. He sat silent for some minutes, then asked for the date. What date of the month was it? he was told, and began figuring. It would be 3 weeks before he would be able to take time off his work to go to Moscow. If they only did not send Hilda off into the provinces before then, he would see about it. He must write. He must get word to her. An expression of joy slowly lit up his face, joy and wistfulness. The end.